Elite SEAL snipers, armed with million-dollar rifles, couldn't hit a thing. The wind was a phantom they couldn't conquer. Then, a quiet old woman tending the base's native plants spoke up, "Gentlemen, you're reading it all wrong." The wind at Naval Special Warfare Base, Eagles Talon, was a living entity. It howled and off the Pacific, a raw, untamed force that slammed into the sheer cliffs of the Washington coastline, churning the air into an unpredictable vortex. On this particular Tuesday, it was a beast ripping through the sparse, resilient pines and whipping sea spray across the exposed firing range. This was where the best of the best came to be broken and remade, but today, the breaking was winning. 5 figures lay prone in a perfect line, their forms nearly invisible against the damp earth, clad in the latest multi-cam camouflage. They were ghosts in training, America's elite SEAL snipers, each man a master of breath control, ballistics, and the art of the unseen kill. In front of them sat their instruments of godlike power, Barrett M82A1 rifles, magnificent tools of precision engineering, each worth more than a luxury car. But against the phantom wind, they were rendered almost useless. 800 yards away, a steel silhouette target mocked them, swaying tauntingly in the gale. It should have been a simple shot, a warm-up for men of their caliber. Yet for the past hour, their .50 caliber rounds have been going wide, painting a frustrating pattern of misses on the dirt berm behind the target. "Damn it!" Lieutenant Caden Thorne, call sign Hotshot, spat the words into his radio mic, his voice a low growl of pure frustration. He was the team leader, a man whose sharp jawline and even sharper arrogance were forged in the fires of a dozen successful operations. He was used to winning, to dominating any environment he was in. This wind, this infuriating, invisible enemy, was an insult to his very being. Another miss, low and left. The anemometer is giving us garbage readings. It's gusting from 10 to 30 knots out of the northwest, but it feels like it's coming from everywhere at once. A few yards away, Alara Vance knelt in the damp soil, her focus entirely on the root ball of a small shore pine she was planting. At 65, her face was a beautiful, intricate map of a life lived outdoors, etched with fine lines around her clear, pale blue eyes. A cascade of silver-white hair was tucked neatly under a simple, faded green beanie. Her hands, though wrinkled and smudged with dirt, moved with a practiced, gentle grace, tamping down the earth around the fledgling tree. She wore a plain, mud-stained canvas work coat over a thick wool sweater, the unofficial uniform of the base's horticulturalist. To the operators, she was part of the landscape, as unremarkable as the coastal shrubs she so meticulously cared for. They saw an old woman, a civilian contractor who quietly went about her work, her presence a silent backdrop to their world of high-stakes training. They didn't notice the profound stillness in her posture, or the way her eyes would occasionally drift from her work to scan the fluttering flags, the swaying treetops, and the distant dance of the waves against the cliffs. Another thunderous crack echoed across the range, followed by the distant, unsatisfying thump of a round hitting dirt. Thorne slammed a fist into the ground beside his rifle. "This is impossible. It's a waste of ammo." Alara paused, her hand hovering over a patch of wind-strafed dune grass. She slowly rose to her feet, her joints protesting with a soft creak. She brushed the dirt from her worn work pants, her gaze fixed on the distant target, then on a flock of gulls struggling against an unseen current of air far down the range. She took a deep, slow breath, tasting the salt and pine on the wind. Then, in a voice that was quiet but carried with the clarity of a bell, she spoke. "It's not coming from the northwest." The 5 snipers, cocooned in their world of scopes, wind charts, and suppressed fury, flinched as if a stray round had just whizzed past their ears. They turned in unison, their expressions a mixture of confusion and irritation. Alara Vance stood 20 yards behind them, her hands resting on a wooden-handled spade, her posture unassuming. She was looking not at them, but past them towards the cliffs that bordered the north side of the range. "The main wind is," she continued, her voice calm and even, "But you're in a bowl here. The cliff face is creating a vortex. See how the grass bends back on itself about halfway downrange? Your bullets are hitting a wall of air, pushing them left. Then a downdraft is shoving them low. You're fighting a spiral." She pointed a dirt-caked finger. "You need to be thinking about a southeasterly crosswind at around 20 knots, starting at the 400-yard mark." For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Then, Lieutenant Thorne pushed himself up on his elbows, a slow, incredulous smirk spreading across his face. He looked at his teammates, then back at Alara, as if she were a curious piece of flora she might have planted. "A vortex? A spiral?" He chuckled, the sound dripping with condescension. "Thank you, ma'am. That's fascinating horticultural insight." He turned to his spotter. "Did you get that, Diaz? The gardener says we're in a spiral." Laughter rippled through the other snipers. It wasn't malicious, but it was dismissive, the easy amusement of professionals listening to an amateur's uninformed opinion. "Maybe you can show us how to prune that target into submission next, Grandma." One of them quipped. Alara's expression didn't change. Her pale blue eyes remained fixed on the environment, her face as serene as a calm sea. She wasn't offended. She seemed to be merely stating an observable fact, like noting that the sun rises in the east. It was Master Chief Gunner Hayes who silenced the snickering. Hayes was a man carved from granite and 30 years of service. He had been a SEAL when Thorne was still in diapers, and he possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people. He paced behind his men, his arms crossed over his barrel chest, his eyes narrowed not on the target, but on the old woman. He had heard her words, not just the content, but the quiet, unshakable confidence with which she delivered them. He'd heard terms like downdraft and crosswind from 1,000 instructors, but never with such an intimate, sensory connection to the world around him. Something was different here. "Quiet down," Hayes commanded, his voice a low rumble that instantly cut off the laughter. He walked slowly towards Alara, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stopped a few feet from her, studying her weathered face. "You seem to know a lot about the wind, ma'am. You learn a few things when your job is to keep plants from blowing away," Alara replied simply, her gaze unwavering. Hayes's eyes flickered from her face to her hands, then back again. He saw the dirt, the wrinkles, but he also saw a steadiness that belied her age. A spark of instinct, honed by decades of judging character under fire, ignited in his mind. This wasn't just a gardener. "A spiral. You said," Hayes stated, more a confirmation than a question. He made a decision, one that went against every protocol in the book. It was unorthodox, risky, and potentially humiliating for his elite team. But his gut screamed at him to do it. He turned back to his men, whose faces now held a curious uncertainty. "Lieutenant Thorne," Hayes said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Get up. Let the lady have a try." The air thickened with stunned silence. Thorne stared at his Master Chief, as if he'd just ordered him to surrender to a field mouse. "Master Chief, you can't be serious," Thorne stammered, his arrogance momentarily shattered by disbelief. "I am dead serious, Lieutenant," Hayes retorted, his gaze like steel. "You and your $1,000,000 computers haven't hit a damn thing all morning. Mrs. Vance here seems to have a different approach. Either she's right, and we all learn something, or she's wrong, and we go back to wasting ammunition your way. Now step aside." A tense, awkward silence fell over the range, broken only by the relentless whistling of the wind. Lieutenant Thorne, his face a mask of conflicted emotions, embarrassment, anger, and utter disbelief, hesitantly slid away from his rifle. He did it with the sullen reluctance of a king being asked to abdicate his throne for a peasant. "Be my guest, ma'am," he said, his voice tight with sarcasm. "But that thing has a kick. Don't want you to break a hip." Alara ignored his comment. She walked forward, placing her spade carefully on the ground. Her movements were deliberate, economical, devoid of any wasted motion. She approached the Barrett rifle not as a piece of intimidating hardware, but as a familiar tool, like her shovel or her shears. She knelt, then lay prone behind the weapon with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for her age. Her body didn't just get behind the rifle. It seemed to merge with it, her slight frame becoming an extension of the cold steel and polymer. The 5 elite snipers watched, their smirks having long since vanished, replaced by a wide-eyed, rapt attention. She didn't immediately put her eye to the scope. Instead, she lay perfectly still for a full minute, her cheek resting against the stock. Her eyes were open, scanning everything. She watched a loose strand of her own white hair flutter in the breeze blowing past her face. She observed the subtle shiver of the ferns growing near the firing line. She tracked the erratic flight path of a lone seagull as it was buffeted by the unseen currents downrange. She was reading a language that the SEALs, with all their advanced technology, had forgotten existed. Barometric pressure is dropping, she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. Air's getting heavy. The spiral is tightening. Finally, her eye found the scope. Her breathing, which had been slow and steady, now fell into a deep, rhythmic cadence, the classic sniper's breath that every man there knew by heart. Inhale, exhale, hold. Her finger, wrinkled and stained with soil, found the trigger. But she didn't pull. She waited. The world seemed to hold its breath with her. She was waiting for a lull, a seam in the wind's chaotic tapestry that only she could perceive. Then, on her third exhale, her finger moved. It was not a pull, but a clean, surgical press. The Barrett roared. The muzzle blast was a physical shockwave, kicking up a cloud of dust and rattling a nearby ammo can. Across the 800-yard expanse, the effect was instantaneous and absolute. Through their spotting scopes, the SEALs watched in stunned silence as a tiny black hole appeared dead center on the steel silhouette's head. It was a perfect shot. Not just a hit, but a statement of impossible mastery. Holy Diaz, Thorne's spotter, breathed the word, his voice filled with awe. Thorne himself was speechless, his mouth slightly agape. He stared through his binoculars, unable to process what he had just seen. Beginner's luck. It had to be. But Alara was already working. With a smooth, practiced motion, she worked the bold action, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a new round. There was no hesitation. She didn't pause to reread the wind. She had already understood it. Her eye was still pressed to the scope. Within 30 seconds of the first shot, the rifle roared again. Another perfect hit, this one striking less than an inch from the first, dead in the center of the target's chest. Then came the third shot, and the fourth, and the fifth. She fired with a calm, unhurried rhythm, a metronome of lethal precision. Each round found its mark, clustering in a tight, devastating group that obliterated the center of the target, tearing the thick steel as if it were paper. The distant clang of each impact was a final, undeniable testament to her skill. When the fifth round was fired, she finally pulled her head back from the scope. She lay still for a moment, as if coming out of a trance. The ringing in the air was replaced by a silence so profound it felt louder than the gunshots. 5 of the most dangerous marksmen on the planet stared at the quiet old woman, their minds struggling to reconcile the gardener they thought they knew with the master they had just witnessed. Master Chief Hayes slowly lowered his binoculars, his knuckles white. He walked over to the prone form of Alara Vance, his heavy boots making no sound in the thick, stunned air. He knelt beside her, his expression a mixture of profound respect and burning curiosity. "Ma'am," he said, his voice softer than anyone on the team had ever heard it. "In all my years, I've never seen shooting like that. Who are you?" Alara pushed herself up slowly, first to her knees, then to her feet. She looked at the Master Chief, and for the first time, the men saw something else in her pale blue eyes. A flicker of a past life, a depth that hinted at storms they couldn't possibly imagine. "I'm the gardener, Master Chief," she said quietly. "My name is Alara Vance." The name struck Hayes like a physical blow. Vance. It wasn't a common name, and it triggered a distant, half-forgotten memory. It was from a briefing he'd attended years ago at Fort Bragg, a classified history lesson on unconventional warfare. They'd spoken of ghosts, of clandestine units whose records were buried so deep they barely existed. He remembered a file, a single black and white photograph of a group of young women in sterile fatigues, their faces determined and hard. It was from a program in the late 60s, a CIA-backed initiative to insert female-led intelligence and guerrilla units into Southeast Asia. The program was officially deemed a failure and scrubbed from the records. But the whispers, the legends, remained. Alara Vance. Hayes repeated slowly, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. They called you the Phantom of the Valley, didn't they? In the A Shao Valley. A flicker of surprise crossed Alara's face, quickly masked. That was a long time ago, Master Chief. A different life. The SEALs behind them exchanged shocked glances. Lieutenant Thorne felt the blood drain from his face. The Phantom of the Valley wasn't just a story. It was a legend, a ghost story told in hushed tones at sniper schools. A sniper who operated alone, deep in enemy territory, credited with dozens of high-value target eliminations. A phantom who used the jungle itself as a weapon, who could read the wind by the rustle of a leaf and predict enemy movements by the flight of a bird. The legend said the Phantom was so effective, so terrifying, that entire enemy battalions were diverted to hunt her, yet she vanished without a trace after her tour. No one knew her real name or what became of her. Until now, the cocky, arrogant hotshot was gone, replaced by a humble, deeply ashamed young officer. He stumbled forward, his face pale. "Ma'am, sir, we had no idea," he stammered, the words catching in his throat. He felt like a child who had just tried to teach a master painter how to hold a brush. Alara looked at him, her gaze not angry or triumphant, but filled with a strange, weary understanding. "There is no reason you should have," she said, her voice gentle. "That world is supposed to stay buried." She looked down at her dirt-stained hands. "I prefer this one now. Things grow here." She turned and walked back toward her spade, her duty on the range seemingly concluded. The spell was broken, but the reality that had crashed down upon them remained. They had mocked a living legend. They had dismissed the quiet wisdom of one of the greatest snipers their country had ever produced, simply because she was an old woman tending her garden. The wind still howled around them, but for the first time that day, they felt they were beginning to understand it. They had been trying to conquer it with technology, when all along, they should have been listening to it with respect. Alara picked up her spade, the worn wood of the handle feeling more natural in her hands than the cold steel of the rifle. She was ready to return to her world of soil, roots, and quiet growth. But as she turned, she found Master Chief Hayes blocking her path. His posture was no longer that of a superior overseeing a civilian. It was that of a student before master. "Mrs. Vance," Hayes began, his voice laced with a newfound, profound respect. "What you just did, that wasn't just shooting. That was a lesson. A lesson my men desperately need to learn. The manuals and the simulators can't teach that. Only experience can." He gestured back at the humbled team of snipers. "I'm asking you, officially, if you would be willing to share some of that experience with them." Alara looked past him at the young faces. The mockery was gone, replaced by an earnest, almost desperate curiosity. They looked at her now not as a gardener, but as a keeper of some secret, essential knowledge they had overlooked. She shook her head gently. "Master Chief, I'm just an old woman who plants trees. My time with rifles is long over. They are fine operators. They just got a little lost in the noise of their equipment today. With all due respect, ma'am, you're more than that. And you know it." Hayes insisted, his tone pleading. "You didn't just get lucky. You understand the fundamentals at a level I've never witnessed. Please, any time you can spare would be invaluable." Alara hesitated. For over 40 years, she had cultivated a life of peace, a quiet penance for a past filled with violence. The garden was her sanctuary, a place where she nurtured life to balance the scales. To step back into that other world, even as a teacher, felt like a betrayal of that peace. But then she looked at Caden Thorne. The young lieutenant's arrogance had been stripped away, leaving behind a raw vulnerability. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a silent plea for understanding, for a chance to learn what he had so arrogantly dismissed. She saw in him not a hotshot officer, but a young warrior who, like her so long ago, was trying to master an impossible craft. A slow smile touched her lips, the first they had seen all day. "I suppose," she said softly, "I could share a few old hunting tips. After I finish putting these pines in the ground. They won't survive if the roots dry out." For the next 3 months, the Eagles Talon firing range became a most unconventional classroom. Alara Vance, still in her simple work clothes, would spend a few hours each week with the SEAL sniper team. She never raised her voice. She never taught them about ballistics or weapon maintenance. They already knew that. Instead, she taught them how to see. She made them lie in the grass for an hour without their scopes, simply watching how the wind wrote its story on the world around them. She taught them to tell the difference between a surface wind and a high-altitude shear by observing the clouds. She showed them how the temperature of the ground itself could create thermal updrafts that would lift a bullet, a lesson she illustrated by having them shoot over sun-baked asphalt versus damp, cool soil. She brought them into the coastal forest and taught them camouflage, not with ghillie suits, but by using the natural shadows and vegetation, becoming part of the environment instead of just hiding in it. She taught them patience, stillness, and above all, humility. Thorne became her most dedicated student. He absorbed every lesson with a ferocious intensity, his old arrogance replaced by a quiet, burning desire to learn. He learned that the most important tool a sniper has is not their rifle or their scope, but their own disciplined mind. Under Alara's guidance, he transformed from a great marksman into a true master of his craft and a more thoughtful leader. The official records will never show it, but Alara Vance's quiet tutelage revolutionized the sniper program at Eagles Talon. The team's long-range accuracy improved by over 50% in unpredictable conditions. More importantly, a new culture of humility and environmental awareness took root. The operators learned that wisdom doesn't always wear a uniform or carry a rank, and that true mastery comes from listening more than commanding. Alara Vance was indeed the Phantom of the Valley. Her file, buried in a sub-basement of Langley, detailed a series of missions so audacious they bordered on myth. She had earned a Distinguished Service Cross for an operation where, for 3 days, she single-handedly held off an enemy advance on a compromised listening post, saving an entire platoon of Green Berets. The medal was awarded in a secret ceremony and immediately classified, her heroism erased from public history for the sake of operational security. When the war ended, she did what many warriors do when faced with the ghosts of their past. She sought the opposite of what she had known. She traded the rifle for a spade, the destruction of life for its cultivation. For 40 years, she had found her peace in the quiet, patient work of her hands, tending the gardens at a place where the next generation of America's finest were forged, a silent guardian watching over them. On one windswept Tuesday morning, the warrior within the gardener had allowed herself to become visible once more, not to fight a war, but to teach a vital lesson. The most extraordinary people are often hidden in the most ordinary of places. They're the janitors who understand quantum physics, the librarians who were once master spies, and the quiet old women whose steady hands once shaped the course of history. Have you ever met someone who completely shattered your initial stereotype of them? Share the story of a person who surprised you in the comments below, and please, always comment with respect. And if stories like Alara Vance's remind you that heroes walk among us every single day, often disguised in the quiet dignity of their work, please subscribe and share. Because the next time you overlook someone in a humble profession, remember, you might just be looking at a legend.